I'm rising to move Amendment 103 in my name, and I'd like to thank the noble lady Baroness Hollins for adding her name. This is a modest amendment, simply seeking to ensure that a person is not categorised as terminally ill if they've refused life-saving treatment influenced by mental disorder. And I think the noble lady Baroness Keeley has said perceptively some of the issues that are concerning me and why I tabled this amendment. That is, we're talking about tackling any individual who effectively voluntarily brings themselves within the definition of terminal illness as defined in the bill. Now, for supporters of the bill, and I think we heard this in the previous group, the 6-month prognosis is presented very often as clear-cut. We all know what we mean by terminal illness. And actually, usually in public discussions, the examples given are of cancer and again, it seems fairly clear-cut. But I think we did hear in the previous group that life and death and diseases are rather more complicated, and I thought especially that the noble Lord Moylan raised some very thought-provoking issues in that. So I want to make it a bit more concrete what terminal illness would mean in the examples that I talk about. I've noted that the noble lady Baroness Coffey actually started this theme in the previous group, and I was very affected by the moving speech by the noble Lord Farmer that also pertains to this. What if someone who is suffering a serious depressive episode, perhaps related to a debilitating physical illness that is difficult but nonetheless treatable, what would happen if perhaps in a temporary period of despair they refused treatments such as dialysis or HIV antivirals, therefore potentially leading them to a situation of terminal ill prognosis? Would they, I ask the noble and learned Lord, be eligible for assisted death in that instance? Or take a suicidal person, perhaps a prisoner, suffering mental distress, who has attempted to take his own life several times before, but suicide prevention policies have saved him. And I'm thinking here actually particularly of prisoners that I've long campaigned for who are on IPP sentences and tragically suicide figures amongst that group of prisoners is very high, and suicidal ideation is a real factor for those prisoners. So our imagined prisoner is not just mentally disturbed, but as it happens, is also physically dependent on insulin for diabetes and needs to take that to remain alive. If that person refuses to take that treatment and becomes seriously ill, bringing upon himself the inevitability of having a progressive disease and becoming terminal, would he be eligible for assisted death under this bill? Because it seems to contradict the slogan of many of the bill's supporters, which we frequently hear people saying they're dying anyway. As it happens, it's a phrase I find particularly chilling. But in this instance, they aren't dying anyway. They would be dying in a self-induced way. So how will the idea of terminal illness in those instances be weighed up? But to note, take our IPP prisoner refusing to take the treatment and the insulin, perhaps even refusing to eat or drink. That, of course, could lead to an inevitable assisted death because he would meet the physical criteria of terminal illness. But actually, the root cause is not inevitably progressive. Imagine, for example, and I like to imagine this, that we as parliamentarians, along with campaigners, are successful in ensuring that IPP prisoners are freed from the hopelessness of an abolished sentence, because we've been successful. Therefore, that awful abolished prison sentence, which psychiatrists uniformly and consistently say is a major factor in making people suffer mental illness in prison. If that IPP was ended, then that prisoner could resume their medical treatment because their mental ill health would have changed, because the social circumstances would have changed. And therefore, they could resume, their treatment, start engaging again, feel that they have a reason to live and become treatable with recovery possible. But not if it's too late and they've already had an assisted death. In other words, terminal prognosis is not inevitable in that instance if self-induced, driven by a disturbance of the mind. Now, I know that the noble and learned Lord Falkner has some insight into the issues in this amendment, as he himself has, as he's explained, talked about the issues involved in it, that any disease caused by, and tabled an amendment, and talked about any disease caused by a person not eating or drinking when that occurs as a result of mental disorder. And obviously the focus there is on anorexia and eating disorders. But isn't this a similar example? And I raise these issues because there is a loophole. This is a loophole that's been nagging at me. And I just can't see anywhere in the bill where safeguards exist to prevent such undoubted unintended outcomes. But without those safeguards, that could mean that the drafting of the bill could inadvertently incentivise self-destructive choices about taking treatments for illnesses that are actually treatable, and lead to irreversible early death facilitated by state medical services, when actually life-saving medical treatments could have ensured that they live and not be categorised as terminally ill. And so it's that confusion about who defines what is terminal illness if you put yourself into the category that I'd like the noble and learned Lord to reassure me about and clarify.